Hi, welcome to another podcast episode of Connected. In this episode, we are going to discuss global commerce with Professor Luís Campos Cunha, Professor of Economics here at Nova, and Vice President of Banco Portugal. Thank you so much for joining us.
Former.
Former Vice President of Banco Portugal. Thank you so much for joining us. Um, to to begin, I would just like to ask to provide a little bit of context about the current situation. So, how would you describe the current moment in the world economy? And do you think that we are facing a cyclical turbulence or a structural transformation?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. And let me just say almost a technical point. Any cyclical um, uh, problem is always leads to some structural changes. Say
Hmm.
the subprime with the toxic assets 12 years ago led to changes in the supervision and regulation of the financial sector,
Hmm.
which is, of course, structural in that sense. So it's a bit difficult to say. We will see probably in 3 or 4 years after Trump goes away how much of this is just some turbulence or what will be the impact in structural terms. But there will be some structural effects, no doubt about that. I think that you see, we are living in a post-war economic era where the United States was the leading economy, with dollar being the international currency, and and that has been changed by Trump, because Trump is not willing to lead this situation in this equilibrium that we got in the last 70 years or 60 years. Um, and it is a bit surprising because that the both Putin and Xi Jinping and some other leaders less important were very much willing to change this equilibrium of the international economic and political situation. Um, and so Trump is doing the job they would like to do. So he's making their lives very easy. And that is also the erratic and irrational behavior of Trump also led or is leading to uh, lack of trust in the situation, the economic and political situation. Let's say NATO participation of the United States. Is Trump willing to comply with the duties of NATO? I doubt it, and a lot of people do. So the the leading role of the United States is clearly at stake in this very moment. And this will have lasting effects, because no one knows if in 10 years we're going to have another Trump
Mhm.
or another guy of the same sort. So it's for sure forever a change in structural terms.
Hmm. So, speaking about the US, um, just for clarity, for some viewers that might not be aware, could you characterize the current US trade policy and how the rest of the world has responded to that policy?
To the trade policy, right?
Yes.
Well, Trump very early introduced tariffs, huge, gigantic tariff rates, um, unlawful, by the way. The World Trade Organization, the terms of the World Trade Organization were violated. The way he computed the tariffs is absurd, completely absurd. He imposed tariffs to an island that has no people living in. Um, why? They don't. I don't think they export anything or import. So it's absolutely absurd, and it's willing to increase and decrease according to political and the mood of Mr. Trump. Canada is one of many examples of every time he has a quarrel with the Prime Minister of Canada, he decides to increase tariffs and then decreases and then increases again. So it's absolutely erratic. He he attacked all the, in economic terms, all the allies of the United States, Canada, Mexico, European Union, United Kingdom, which is absurd, and being very friendly with Mr. Putin and not talking about China. Um, Never mentioned China basically on this on recent terms. So it's extremely difficult to rationalize and extremely difficult to understand the trade policy. And there are some impact on, you see, the, the world monetary system is based on the dollar, which means that central banks all over the world need to have dollars. And as the economy grows and so on, they need more and more dollars. The way to of the United States to give dollars to the world is to have a current account deficit. I've always told my students that it's good to import. If you import more goods, you have more goods available for consumption, for investment, for public consumption. So it's exports are it reduces the amount of goods. So importing is good. The only problem is that with all countries, you cannot run current account deficit importing more than exporting because in, your international debt will increase and at some point you have to pay back. So you have to have a surplus in the current account. And I always tell them there's one exception to that, which is the United States, because they can print pieces of paper, call it dollars, and give to the world. So they export pieces of paper and they import more goods than they export, which is fantastic. It's called international seigniorage. Furthermore, what central banks do with this cash in dollars? They buy treasury bonds, which mean treasury bills and treasury bonds, which means they finance the budget deficit of the United States. So the United States have been enjoying the best of all worlds, is having a sustainable current account deficit, importing more goods than exporting, and financing at the same time the budget deficit. He wants to change that. He wants to have a current account, balanced current account. Why? It's a bad decision, and of course, this creates the doubt of the dollar as an international currency, and being the anchor of the international monetary system. And the alternative is going to be, it's good for Europeans probably if there is, it's not going to be the end, of course, It's probably going to be the euro or some other currency. I have no idea. But so it's completely absurd and irrational, but
Mm-hmm.
that's the way it is. I mean, I'm
Mm-hmm.
not the only one to say this,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of people is writing that on American newspapers. Some of them were my professors, by the way, at Columbia University.
Mm-hmm. So you believe that the U.S. trade policy is not only harming um, its allies, but also the U.S. itself
Yeah.
by yeah. But speaking of its allies and Europe, um, it's been hard to conduct policy in such an uncertain environment due to the uncertainty that you have described. Um, and the European Union has responded in some ways, um, but it's struggling to have the competitive edge against China and against US, um, and it's placed some additional protections in markets like EV, with China losing some access to the US market due to the increased protection. Should the EU also adopt more and more protection um, to safeguard its industry?
Well, with the pandemic and now with the war in uh, in Ukraine and with the erratic behavior of Trump, all that compound, Europe, European Union, uh, realized that this deindustrialization went too far. And it's too dependent on the international market. For the United States, dependent on weapons, on military goods, and vis-a-vis China on manufacturing goods. Um, and so there's a lot of talk about reindustrialization of Europe. And what is the optimal policy for that? And the optimal policy depends what is the objective. Okay, if the objective is to be less dependent of China, so it's a trade objective, then the optimal policy is a tariff. However, if you have to realize that a tariff is arithmetically equal to a tax on consumption plus a subsidy on production. So if your aim is just to help domestic production of goods, period, in manufacturing goods, then the optimal policy is a subsidy for the industry in the European Union. So it depends a little bit what is the objective. Is the objective to reduce the dependency on China, or the objective is to increase the production of industrial goods in the European Union? The first calls for a tariff, the second one calls for a subsidy on production,
Mhm.
and that's the least cost depending on exact objective. And in my view, it's not very clear what the aim is. Okay, so because you might be worried by your the dependence on China, but you are not worried on dependence on, I don't know, on the United Kingdom, for instance. So a tariff um, would not be a tariff vis-a-vis all countries would be different. So it depends a lot on the objective, and it's not very clear, in my view, what is the aim of the European Union.
Mhm. But with Europe losing its easy access to the American markets and with China dominating industrial production, is it still viable for Europe to think that it can compete on high value added industries?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's uh, you see, the European Union is gigantic in research and innovation. Um, um, it's a very large economy, not a very large country in a sense. In economic terms, European Union is a country. So, um, so it is certainly able to compete. If this degree of specialization went too far and too dependent on China, say, then it can use proper instruments to spur the production, domestic production of whatever goods they want. Um, so it's not a big issue. I mean, of course that implies probably the reduction of production in other sectors because you if you want to produce more cars, of course you absorb resources from other sectors, and that implies alternative ways. So it's European Union has to be more competitive, needs to be more flexible. But that's another story. I mean, it is independent of what is the objective vis-a-vis China. I mean, it's a general idea that uh, innovation appears, and the first thing that worries European Union is to regulate that innovation, say artificial intelligence or whatever. It's the first thing they want to do is to regulate it. I don't. I'm not sure if it is the best approach, and in that sense, it's certainly undermining growth in Europe for the last 25 years. And the European economy has underperformed vis-à-vis the United States, not to mention China. So but that's independent of this issue we were talking about. That's a general comment we have to make about the European Union.
Hmm. But even if Europe were to adapt those policy instruments, either tariffs or subsidies, um, uh, are you afraid that that could trigger more retaliation from the United States when their policy in trade has already been very protectionist? Or is it better for Europe to remain a bastion of free trade for growth?
A European Union is not a fortress as some economic terms, but of course, the European Union at the same time needs to have some self-sufficiency. It's an objective in trade, which calls for a tariff. Um, but it should be to some extent self-sufficient in certain sectors or close to self-sufficient. Um, and that is in fact what happened with the common agricultural policy. It started in the 50s because they were coming from the Second World War when there was famine in Europe because most of the agricultural goods, most of the food was imported from South America, from the United States, from Argentina, from Canada, and of course with the war that was made it very difficult, and of course that provoked a lot of pain and a lot of stress and famine in Europe. So the European Union answered that, say we want to have some self-sufficiency in agricultural goods, in food for our population. That's the common agriculture policy that we still have today, with other objectives and dressed some in a different way. But nevertheless, it it came from there. So we need probably a kind of common industrial policy program so that Europe should be, I wouldn't say self-sufficient, but close to. It's not going to be an easy task because there is a lot of debandling in industrial goods. I mean, you look at the car. It has, I don't know, 5,000 parts. Some of them are coming from Taiwan, others come from the United States, others come from South America, and they are put together in Germany or France. So it's not going to be easy to have that kind of policy for the European manufacturing sector. But it probably makes sense, I guess.
Hmm. Earlier in the conversation, you were mentioning that these moments of divergence between Europe and the US could lead to more lasting effects. If those effects turn out to be a further divergence, are there any other markets that Europe turn to in terms of trade to compensate for the US, either Mercosur, some other trade deals currently in the works, maybe Indonesia or India?
Yeah, there's been mentioned several times that South America, namely Mercosur, could be an alternative for um, alternative, I would say, but would be some form of minimizing the impact of the American policies. Um, and certainly India, it's a gigantic market. India has always been it was a former British colony, um, and so some of the standards are closer uh, to the European ones than to the American ones. So would make life easier for European producers to export to, say, India or South America. India is gigantic. It's growing. I mean, it's the largest in terms of population. Is the largest country in the world. It's extremely bureaucratic, and it has a long tradition of non-free trade. I'm not sure if the current authorities, Modi and its allies, would be willing to now open up to more to trade, to international trade. But I would guess that they would be beneficial not only for Europe, but would be beneficial for the Indians themselves. So I presume it would not be a difficult task to have some deals with India. With Mercosur, it's easier. I mean, there's an agreement that has to be approved. The French are dragging their feet to approve it because it will be approved by every single country, and France is in a sense blocking the approval of the agreement with Mercosur. Portugal is one of the countries that has supported more that agreement. I presume Spain would do the same. So it is an agreement with it's a large economy, the South American Mercosur. It's a large economy. It's growing very fast, and I presume would be a big advantage for them and for ourselves.
Hmm.
I didn't mention you asked me some about retaliation of the United States. Yeah, the United States can retaliate, of course, and they have power to do that. And and Mr. Trump is not ashamed of doing that. But one has to be also look at the Chinese. The Chinese never engage in negotiations with Americans. They impose the tariff of 10%. The Chinese, okay, 10% also. They are 50%. We also have 50%. And we complain to the World Trade Organization because you are not complying with the rules. But they didn't want to. They didn't go to butter the bread of Mr. Trump. They just responded
Hmm.
on equal terms. And in the end, it was Mr. Trump that gave up on these crazy increases of tariffs. And now they seem that they are reaching an agreement. I'm not sure if they already did. Um, So I would not be completely afraid because Mr. Trump, which is now the American policy, is just designed by Mr. Trump, is always willing to back off from what he said one day. He's gonna say something else the next day, and without any problem. So I'm sure that he would cope with the situation with an with a retaliation to the retaliation, let's say.
You've also mentioned the fact that the dollar is the base of the financial system, and of course, China would like to challenge that. But let's say in 25 years, in 50 years, could we see a world in which the dollar is not the only currency at the base of the financial system, or at least it's more heavily contested?
Now, look, it's the international monetary system is always going to be based in one currency. I mean, or 70% based on one currency, let's
Mhm.
say. Until the Second World War was the pound, the British pound. Um, then the world changed with the Second World War and became, with Bretton Woods, became the dollar the anchor of the system. I do not foresee any other currency to compete with the dollar. The euro is probably the closest alternative. And if you look at international reserves of central banks, the, the leading currency is the dollar, but then the second is the euro. Okay, so this would go on for a long time, except that Mr. Trump came to power, and we don't know what's going to happen. So, and the only alternative I can foresee is not going to be the ruble or the yen or no, or the Brazilian currency or a mix of currencies. And there was this idea, the IMF. Now, none of those proved in the past, and none of those will succeed in the near future, foreseeable future. And I'm not talking about near, even in the long term, foreseeable future. Um, so, if the Americans succeed in destroying the anchor of the system, the alternative is going to be the euro.
Mhm.
It's not going to be the yen or.
Could but could a candidacy put forward by the BRICS countries as a whole be a viable alternative?
No,
Or
no, they have been talking about it for ages, and that's not.
mm,
I mean, they hate each other first of all. Okay, so so it's not. You cannot put on the same basket countries that are so different uh, and so uneven in terms of in political terms. I don't think that is viable any BRICS alternative to international monetary system. Now it just a pleasure for them to have conferences and to talk about it, but there is no
mhm,
real fact that is going to come. Zero.
mhm,
I mean, you say you have China, but you have India. India and China barely have relations with each other in political terms. How can they agree on creating a currency? Probably the Chinese want to have an international currency, but it's their currency. So it's forget it. I know there is a lot of talk in the BRICS about creating some alternative to the dollar. The Americans have been able to destroy their system, and so another one is going to pop up for
mhm,
sure, but it's not going to be the BRICS, the alternative.
mhm. But speaking of this fractalization of the financial system, with different currencies being being alternative to the dollar. Do you think that the trade as a whole will become more fractured, um, or will it be more conducted more heavily uh, in in partnership with geopolitics, or is there a future where we can go back to how it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago, where trade was more for economic reasons and for a free market?
I'm not sure if I really understood the question, but
Sorry,
uh,
maybe I
no,
was a
it's my
bit.
fault. It's my fault. Um, um, i- i- Politics, of course, influence trade and trade agreements. That's the reason I said that the BRICS cannot be an alternative to anything
Mhm.
because they don't agree with each other. They hate each other politically, so it's not going to be the alternative is not going the alternative to the dollar will never come from the BRICS for the
Mhm.
foreseeable future. Um, so the globalization and free trade everywhere is probably now being questioned. It's not now because of the of Trump. Is even before that. Well, basically with the pandemic, people began to realize uh, that dependency on international trade, the same argument as I said about food uh, in Europe after the Second World War. So suddenly people realize that, well, maybe we should have some degree of self sufficiency. Um, and so this movement towards free trade everywhere is clearly being questioned um, for quite some time, for the last 5 years, I would say. And now with the success of the car industry of China in Europe, that is also threatening the industry in Germany, and the car industry is the backbone of manufacturing sector in Germany. So all of that created a uproar about free trade. So I'm sure that these political and economic consequences of this globalization is going to have some there will be a pause, even a retreat to some going back to some extent here and there. But of course, in the long run, I believe in free trade. So I presume that in the long run, as long as there are no wars and no pandemics, and we will have a freer trade than we will have in 5 years' time. So, so in the, it's going to be this free trade is going to be very regional in the sense that there will be areas of free trade like European Union, Mercosur. Then these blocks will get together to have some trade agreement. So these free trade zones will by blocks will negotiate trade. Is not going to be Portugal vis-a-vis Brazil or Portugal vis-a-vis Mexico. Is going to be European Union, Mercosur, the Asian countries that are also. So it's going to be blocks like that. And but there will be in the end it is a very cheap way to increase the standards of living and welfare. It's very inexpensive way to do that. To free trade is very inexpensive to increase welfare. So I'm sure that there will be ups and downs, but now we are going in a downturn in terms of free trade. But in the long term, I have no doubts that is going to be. Of course, there are wars, and that's political. I'm talking about real wars. And those wars, of course, prevent countries from trading, and and there will be problems linked to that because no countries that are at war don't get free trade agreements between them.
Of course. Um, Finally, to what extent do you think that the Portuguese economy will be exposed to these new challenges of international markets? Can we expect an increase in our cost of livings?
Well, let me make a point that I've been making for 25 years or more. There is no Portuguese economy. Or if you want to say Portuguese economy is just a region in, there's no national economy, just a region inside the European Union. You see, the how do you define a country in international trade? It's space where you can impose tariffs. Okay, we cannot impose tariffs vis-a-vis no countries. The tariff policy is decided in Brussels and it's for everybody. So we have no tariffs of our own. It's Brussels that does it. In monetary terms, a country is when it has a central bank in the currency. We don't have a currency of our own. We use the euro. So either the euro area or the European Union, depending how you approach the definition of country, is the proper situation for Portugal. Portugal is just a regional economy, small by European standards, is medium sized, but it represents, I don't know, 2% of the GDP of Europe, European Union. So that's a region. So whatever happens to Europe will happen in Portugal. And the question was, what are the impacts of international trade on the Portuguese economy?
Yes.
Well, it's going to be the same as in France or in Germany or in Italy, with particular particular problems of say the Germans will be affected in the car industry. Portugal can be affected in I don't know, textiles or
Hmm.
shoes or the new innovative areas of software of kids like you that decide to produce things like that. So, um, but that's no difference between being in Portugal or in Spain or in France.
Well, that concludes lots of my questions that I had planned. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us
My
about these
pleasure.
things. Thank you.
Thank you.